Merkel Media.
I'm exhausted, looking for everything in the shadows. Start looking at people like they don't matter. I'm waking up to the fact, more than a little bit shallow. I'm lost in this hole, but I don't wanna. I'm lost in this hole, 'cause I'm just trying to
What's up, guys? We are back with another episode of Free the Rabbits this week, and I'm pretty excited about this one. And I've done some research on this particular person in the Bible, but I did it in conjunction with another great person in the Bible, King David. And I've actually talked about this on the confessionals, the Firestones of King David that tie into the Philosopher's Stone, and a bunch of other interesting Nephilim artifacts and things that happen in this story of David. But what I wanted to do is really hone in on King Saul and his lineage and where he actually came from, talk about some of the artifacts that surround him, and really zone in on who he is and why he was put in a position of power as the first king of Israel when they came back and took over the promised land. And if you guys don't know, there was never supposed to be a king of Israel. Yahweh was supposed to rule over Israel as their king, and they were supposed to be headed off by prophets and that type of leadership, and not a kingship. But the Israelites demanded a kingship because they saw all the other nations around them, specifically the ones that they came into the promised land to take over. And a lot of these were Nephilim tribes, and all of these giants, these Rephaim and Zuzim and Anakim and several others. And they saw that the way that they ruled things was the way that the Israelites wanted to also rule things. And this is very typical of mankind. Things are given to you in a way that works, and we are told that this is the path that God gives us to walk, and yet we are unsatisfied. We are very impatient. We want everything right now. And that's why in the book of Enoch that men bartered with these watchers by giving them the daughters of men so they could procreate with them for technology. And we've seen this throughout history. And this is no different here with the Israelites wanting to mimic the tribes and the kingdoms around them to fit in. And instead of trusting in Yahweh and trusting in the plan that was set for them, they push back against it. And this is, again, typical of man. And they should have seen from being able to leave Egypt under Pharaoh to find their way all the way to the promised land and then finally take over these giant tribes with the help of Joshua and Caleb and all the other warriors of Israel, they still aren't satisfied. And they decide that they want to have a ruler just like the rest of the tribes around them. And this is where the story of King Saul comes into place. And for people that don't know, Saul was a monarch of ancient Israel and Judah and the first king of the United Monarchy, according to the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. So you're going to see this a lot in mainstream historical accounts where they'll try to disprove the Bible and say that the Bible isn't true, even though the Bible is one of the main sources of finding all these different archaeological discoveries throughout history. And it's funny how there'll be things that pop up in the Bible and historians will point to that and say, no, this is exactly why it's a book of lies, it's a book of mythologies. And then there'll be some sort of archaeological discovery and it will prove it right. And this happens time and time again. And I could show you a ton of those different ways, but we're not here to do that today. We're here to talk about King Saul and his reign. It was traditionally placed in the late 11th century BC, supposedly marked the transition of the Israelites from a scattered tribal society ruled by various judges to organized statehood. So the prophet Samuel and his sons, which were judges, they basically ruled over Israel. And I wouldn't say ruled in the sense of like a king, but they were there to help the tribes when they had issues, to preside over any kind of arguments or any kind of sins that would happen within the tribes. And this is where the book of Judges comes into play too. And there are some interesting stories in the book of Judges. And I'm going to read a little bit of mainstream verbiage on what they say Saul is. The historicity of Saul and the United Kingdom of Israel is not universally accepted. And again, that's mainstream history that's going to present that to you. However, they've done this before, many, many times before, with many other people and historical figures throughout the Bible, and then they pop up on a random stele or some sort of hieroglyph somewhere or some sort of tomb somewhere. It just seems to happen constantly. And it also lends to, I want to throw this out there too, because I've said this many times, because one of the biggest pushbacks from people who don't believe in the inerrant word of God is that it is a copy of the Ugaritic text from Sumerian culture. And you've heard me say this plenty of times on the show, and how that the Sumerian texts are the oldest known text. But I've also thrown the caveat out there, it's the oldest known text. I believe that there have been several things found throughout history when it comes to archaeological finds that would prove the Bible correct that have been hidden. And if we want to believe that there is some sort of cover-up, or if we want to talk about these occultists who are in high power in governments all over the place, who are vehemently against Christianity, then absolutely they would look to cover up certain things if they can. Now, I do believe in the power of God, and I believe that God's bigger than all that, and that's why a lot of this stuff comes out. But I'm not saying that there aren't things behind the scenes that are hidden from us that would prove it emphatically. And I do think more of this stuff will come out, especially as things ramp up around us with all the craziness. I do think that there's an antithesis to that. That's that hope that I always talk about, where we don't need to live in fear, because I feel like there's this other side of it that's going to rise up out of it. It's very similar to what's happened with P. Diddy and now Jay-Z, which I called early this year was going to happen once Diddy became the fall guy, that the next fall guy would probably be Jay-Z. But I also am going to say the spin to the fall guy narrative is that there is a power of Yahweh that is helping expose this stuff too. It's not just like these elites are, well, we're going to put this guy, there's a fall guy so they can take all the rap. not wholly. I think that there are things that are revealed, and because those things are revealed, then they have to shift and change that. And I think this is the inevitable battle between good and evil that we have seen since the dawn of time, that we read about in Scripture. And I think that the idea that King Saul didn't exist, I just don't buy, because there's too much evidence of King David existing. And the story of Saul is very indicative of what set up King David into his position of power as becoming the ruler over Israel and being the man after God's own heart, even though he had many of his own flaws, just like all of us do. And that's why I love the story of David, because he's super flawed, but yet from his line came the lineage that helped bring Jesus to us, Yeshua to us. That was out of David's bloodline, the tribe of Judah. And this is going to help us see this struggle between good and evil, this bloodline struggle, and show us that Saul, King Saul himself, was a Nephilim. He was from Nephilim bloodline, and I can show you this emphatically from the Bible. We're not going to even look at any extra canonical text today. We're going to talk specifically from the Bible. We're going to break down some of these Hebrew words. We're also going to talk about some of this alchemical armor that King Saul possessed, that David also wore. And we're going to show you how I think that was part of his Nephilim heritage. But from all indications, King Saul was a Nephilim. Now, you may ask, well, why would God appoint a Nephilim as the first king of Israel? Well, he did it on purpose because, one, the Israelites begged and demanded for a king. It actually made God very angry when the prophet Samuel came to him about this. And we're going to go through the scripture today. I'm going to show you some very interesting stuff about King Saul that I started really piecing together when I was getting information for this episode, and I really wanted to nail down the Nephilim origin of King Saul and why that it's important that the first king of Israel, albeit he was a Benjamite, he was from the tribe of Benjamin, and this will show you that all of these tribes of Israel had intermingled in with these Nephilim bloodlines. And this is after the flood. It's not to say that all the Israelites were mixed in with Nephilim, but you had portions of these tribes that had. And I've talked about Moab and the lion men and the tribe of Gad, how that the Moabites and the Gadites were all in the same area. This was shown on the Mesha Stele, which I've talked about, and how that from that, then we know scripturally that we had the lion faces of Gad, these hybridized lion-faced Gadites, and then we had these lion-like men of Moab, which one of the mighty men, Benaiah, fought as well. And this is all shown scripturally. So we know there's been intermingling, and there's way more examples of this, especially when it comes to giant bloodlines. We talked about some of the mighty men actually being Nephilim, and I've actually got another one today that I ran across. And I told you my good Nephilim theory is always growing because I'm always digging for info, and a lot of times I won't be looking for that specific topic directly, but as I'm looking at something else, I'm digging, I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, this just popped up, and this is a person in the Bible. It's clearly an Nephilim, and he's good. So we will talk about that. And matter of fact, Saul would be considered in that category too, because he was given this position by God. He worshiped Yahweh, at least initially, how Yahweh wanted him to. Now, granted, he turned his back on God, especially towards the back end of his life, especially when David came along and he became jealous of David, which we'll talk a little bit about today. But again, this is going to be mainly focused on King Saul and how he became in this position. I'm going to show you his lineage per the Bible today. We're going to look at the Hebrew, and we're going to show you how that he is actually from a Nephilim bloodline and why that Yahweh would put someone who is of a Nephilim bloodline in that position. So we're going to start with 1 Samuel 8 and verse 1. Now, this is the prophet Samuel. He had appointed his sons as judges, and he's getting old. And the problem was his two sons, the firstborn Joel and his second was Abijah, and they didn't walk in his ways. They were actually dishonest. They were accepting bribes. They were perverting justice. And that's part of the reason, too, why the Israelites were, well, we'd rather just have a king if they're doing this, even though Samuel walked with God and some of these other judges did. Instead of them trusting God that, one, Samuel would get his sons in line or boot them out, or God would straighten them out, they would rather have a king like all the other tribes around them. Now, I'm going to go to verse 4 of 1 Samuel 8. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. Look, they said, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to judge us like all the other nations. But when they said, give us a king to judge us, their demand was displeasing in the sight of Samuel, so he prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for it is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, just as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are doing to you. Now listen to their voice, but you must solemnly warn them and show them the manner of the king who will reign over them. So Yahweh's telling Samuel, don't fret. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me, just like they did since they left Egypt. And matter of fact, I've talked off and on about some of the Egyptian stories. We talked about the Elohim. If you want to go back and listen to the history of the Elohim, I did with Pastor Justin Kaiser, where we talk about these different gods. And that's what he's talking about right there, serving other gods. And they're not talking about idols that are graven images. They're talking about legitimate Elohim gods, these lesser G gods who they're worshiping, which there are a ton of them in this area that they're in right now in the Promised Land. All of these giant tribes who are the product of a lot of these fallen entities, they worship these gods that are roaming around the earth with them now. So, this is typical Israelite behavior. And honestly, I wouldn't even say their behavior, just all mankind's behavior. We get impatient, want what we want, and then we're willing to do whatever we can to get it. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who are asking him for a king. He said, this will be the manner of the king who will reign over you. So at this point, he breaks down all of the things that this new king's going to do. And he's saying, listen, he's going to take all your sons and your daughters and put them to work. All the harvest that you reap, he's going to give it to his people that work for him directly. You're going to make all of his weapons of war, equipments for his chariots. And he's going to take the best of your fields, the best of your vineyards, the best of your olive groves. He's going to give them to his servants. He's going to take your grain, your grape harvest, and he's going to take your donkeys, your cattle, your flocks, and he's going to take you as his personal slaves as well, his servants. So he's telling them, listen, I'm telling you right now what's going to happen if God gives you a king. And in verse 19, nevertheless, the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we must have a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to judge us, to go out before us, and to fight our battles. So what they're seeing around them are these other nations who, a lot of them were giants or had giants ruling over them, residing over them, and they would go out to battle with them. We know of King Og and his brother Sion. We know that they would go out to battle. They would go in the front of battle. They're giants. And this is close to around time also. We've got Goliath and his brothers. We got Ishbai Benob. We got all of these different giants that would go out in the front of battle. They were also leaders of nations and tribes, and they had communion with the gods too. I mean, a lot of these gods, especially if they were fallen angels, they were products of. So they would go out with the blessings of these gods into battle. Now, when Samuel goes back to God again, after he's warned them, they say, no, we still want it. So the Lord says, listen to their voice, appoint a king for them. Now, this is where the story jumps, because it's going to jump to Saul and what Saul's doing. The story is going to shift from God talking to Samuel, and then it's going to go to Saul and what leads Saul up to Samuel, and then it's going to jump back to God talking to Samuel. And I'm going to read some of these verses, get to some of the story, and then I'm going to come back and do some exegesis on these early verses so you guys can understand in the Hebrew why Saul was a Nephilim, why he was from a Nephilim bloodline, and why that's important to this story. Because that was something that I found really fascinating to myself. What's the significance of God putting a Nephilim in charge of Israel as their first king? What's the significance of that? Because we know that David comes along and he is a man after God's own heart. We know from David that Yeshua comes from. What's the significance of putting this Nephilim into place? Well, we already have one signifier with the fact that God told the people what was going to happen if he put a king in charge, because he said that they wanted a king, even though he told them that they didn't need a king, that they pushed back on God. So at this point, God said, you know what? Cool. I'll give you a king. I'm going to give you just what you want to. Big, giant Nephilim king that can roll out to battle, that can scare people, that you see all these other nations doing. Instead of trusting me, you want to trust in the big bad boogeyman that's on your side. But again, to the point that it's the big bad boogeyman eventually that really does a lot of harm to Israel early on as his first king, or as their first king. So we'll go to 1 Samuel 9. Now there was a Benjamite, a powerful man whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah of Benjamin. And he had a son named Saul, choice and handsome, without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the people. Now, both of these verses are very significant in the Hebrew, but we are going to come back to these because I want to get to how Saul meets Samuel and how that goes down. And then I'm going to come back and we're going to look at a deeper take on those two verses. And then we're going to have some other verses throughout the Bible that tie into that. And then I'm going to show you how that King Saul was a Nephilim. And then we're going to get into more of the story of King Saul. And we're going to start talking about this alchemical, magical armor that he also had, which I think is a signifier of him being a Nephilim also. Now, in verse 3, one day the donkeys of Saul's father Kish wandered off. Kish said to his son Saul, take one of the servants, go look for the donkeys. So Saul passed through the hill country of Ephraim and then through the land of Shalisha, but they did not find the donkeys. He and the servant went through the region of Shalim, but they were not there. Then they went through the land of Benjamin, and still they did not find them. When they reached the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant, come, let us go back, or my father will stop worrying about the donkeys and stop worrying about us. Look, said the servant, in this city there is a man of God who is highly respected. Now he's talking about Samuel, but they don't let you know that yet in the scripture. Everything he says surely comes to pass. Let us go there now. Perhaps he will tell us which way to go. And Saul says, well, if we do go there, what are we going to give him? because we've eaten all the bread, we've eaten all the food, we really don't have anything. And the servant says he has a quarter shekel of silver, and he will give it to him. Now, prophets in the day were called seers, and that's actually signified in verse 9 to let you know, because they're about to start calling Samuel a seer, and they want you to know that that's what the prophets of that day were called. So Saul and his servant are headed to find the seer, who's Samuel. Now I'm going to jump to verse 15. Now, on the day before Saul's arrival, the Lord had revealed to Samuel, at this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you're to anoint him ruler over my people Israel. He will save them from the hand of the Philistines, for I have looked upon my people, because their cry has come to me. Now, let's just put this in here, that the Israelites are being oppressed by the Philistines at this time. Saul does put the heavy hand to the Philistines. So it's not like he wasn't used by God. And initially, he did do what God wanted him to do. And I'm going to show you here in the scripture where it says that God changed his heart, which I believe that that was a signifier of also his bloodline, that he had this nature about him. And God did change his heart initially. But again, God also gives us free will. Sometimes we fall back on things that are familiar to us. Verse 17, when Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, here's the man of whom I spoke. He shall rule over my people. Saul approached Samuel in the gateway and asked, would you please tell me where the seer's house is? I am the seer, Samuel replied. Go up before me to the high place, for you shall eat with me today. And that's important because the prophets would eat first, and they would come back and tell the people that they could eat, and this was after a sacrifice. So he's telling Saul that he can come eat with him. So they're going to eat first before anyone else eats. And when I send you off in the morning, I will tell you all that is in your heart. And for the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, do not worry about them, for they have been found, upon whom is all the desire of Israel, if not upon you and all your father's house. Saul replied, am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel? Is not my clan the least of all the clans of Benjamin? So why would you say such a thing to me? That's also another signifier that he was least of the clans of Benjamin. Now, I know there will be theologians say, no, that's just showing you that Saul came from an insignificant part of the tribe of Benjamin, and that's why God chose him to show his might. We already know earlier that Saul is a massive man. I'm going to get to that very shortly, but he's a big dude. He's not like David, where David was the smallest of all his brothers when Samuel went looking for another king later on because Saul wasn't doing what God wanted him to do. This is very different. This is just showing that because of their bloodline, that they were the least of the clans of Benjamin. They were the most deluded in a holy bloodline out of the clans of Benjamin. And he says, so why would you say such a thing to me? Then Samuel took Saul and his servant, brought them into the hall, and seated them in the place of honor among those who were invited, about 30 in all. And Samuel said to the cook, bring the portion I gave you and told you to set aside. So he'd already gotten the portion set aside because he knew that Saul was on his way. So the cook picked up the leg that was attached to it and set it before Saul. Samuel said, here's what was kept back. It was set apart for you. Eat, for it has been kept for you for this occasion. From the time I said I've invited the people. So Saul dined with Samuel that day. And after they had come down from the high place in the city, Samuel spoke with Saul on the roof of his house. They got up early in the morning, and just before dawn, Samuel called to Saul on the roof, get ready, and I will send you on your way. So Saul got ready. Both he and Samuel went outside together. As they were going down to the edge of the city, Samuel said to Saul, tell the servant to go on ahead of us, but you stay for a while, and I will reveal to you the word of God. So the servant went on. So this is where the prophet Samuel is going to anoint Saul and show him his inheritance, that he's going to be the new king of Israel, the first king of Israel, to unite the tribes of Israel. Now, in 1 Samuel 10, verse 1, then Samuel took a flask of oil, poured it on Saul's head, kissed him, and said, has not the Lord anointed you ruler over his inheritance? When you leave me today, you will find 2 men at Rachel's tomb in Zelzah on the border of Benjamin. They will say to you, the donkeys you seek have been found. Now your father has stopped worrying about the donkeys and started worrying about you, asking, what should I do about my son? Then you will go on from there until you come to the oak of Tabor. 3 men going up to God at Bethel will meet you there, one carrying 3 young goats, another carrying 3 loaves of bread, and another carrying a skin of wine. They will greet you and give you 2 loaves of bread, which you will accept from their hands. After that, you will come to Gibeah of God, where the Philistines have an outpost. As you approach the city, you will meet a group of prophets coming down from the high place, preceded by harps, tambourines, flutes, and lyres, and they will be prophesying. The Spirit of the Lord will rush upon you, and you will prophesy with them, and you will be transformed to a different person. Now, when Saul turns to leave Samuel, God changes Saul's heart. This is in verse 9. And all the signs that came to pass that day, when Saul and his servant arrived at Gibeah, a group of prophets met him. Then the Spirit of God rushed upon him, and he prophesied along with them. When all those who had formerly known Saul saw him prophesying with the prophets, they asked one another, "What has happened to the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets?" Then a man who lived there replied, "And who is their father?" So the saying became a proverb, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" And you'll see this periodically throughout Saul's tenure as king, where he is also considered a prophet. And we won't talk about this story today, but I'm sure you know of the story of Saul and the witch of Endor, and there are too many layers to that story to talk about today, and it's not really significant in us talking about Saul being a Nephilim and the alchemical armor of Saul today. But it is important to bring up that in passing, because the reason why he goes to this seer, this witch, to get a message from Samuel, who is dead at the time, because he doesn't have the prophet Samuel to be able to give him wisdom and knowledge, because he hasn't heard anything from God. God is silent to him. And that's very important because he himself was considered a prophet that God spoke through. So this goes back to what I've been talking about, these Nephilim, these giant bloodlines, that there were good ones as well that communed with God, Saul being one of them. And I'm about to break down how that Saul was a Nephilim, because it's very important for us to understand that, because that is important to the story of David and the story of Yeshua, because that is how it all comes around full circle. So the story of Saul and David takes us back to a verse in Genesis, which you'll hear a lot of Nephilim researchers talk about as a huge signifier to this idea of the corrupted bloodlines. And it's Genesis 3:15. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. And this is the idea of the serpent seed as opposed to the perfect seed that Yeshua comes from. And I believe that this is also signified in this story of King Saul and King David, or the future King David, because we know from King David comes Jesus, comes Yeshua. We know this. And it does not come from Saul, and there's a reason for that, because he is of a Nephilim bloodline. Now you may ask, Joel, how does this work? You know, this is something I've never heard of before. I've never heard of the first king of Israel actually being a Nephilim. And there'll be a lot of people probably balk at me saying this, but I can prove this scripturally. And this is not extra canonically. This is going to be directly from scripture. We are going to look at some Hebrew words here, and we're going to break this down. And I think it's very significant, because let's take it back to what I just said earlier. The Israelites wanted a king that looked like the kings of the other nations around them. Most of these were of Nephilim bloodline. They wanted somebody strong in stature, somebody who represented power from a physicality standpoint to rule them, something they could be proud about. And Saul was that. Now we're going to go back to 1 Samuel 9 again, and we're really going to break down these verses. So we'll go to verse 1. Now there was a Benjamite, a powerful man whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechereth, the son of Aphiah of Benjamin. Now, a powerful man. When you translate that into the Hebrew, it's Gibber, a mighty man, the Gibberim. Now, you may say, oh, but Gibber just means strong or mighty, which it does in some cases. But we talked about this since I started this show, that depending on the context, that Gibber or Gibberim will denote a giant or a Nephilim bloodline. And in this case, it is talking about a Nephilim bloodline. So they are talking about Kish, who is Saul's father. They are denoting that he is a Gibberim here. They use the word Gibber in Hebrew to denote a mighty man. And again, I'm going to show you how that this is denoting a giant and not just somebody that's strong, which again, the word Gibber or Gibberim can be used just like it's used for the mighty men or David's mighty men. We've seen that throughout the Bible as well, depending on who they're talking about in the context that it's in. But I'm about to show you how that this is talking about an actual giant bloodline. Verse 2, and he had a son named Saul, choice and handsome, without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the people. Now, this is eerily reminiscent of when the Bible talks about the Anakim, when the 10 spies first went into the promised land and saw these Anakim, and we know that Anak means next above, this Anaki in the Hebrew. It's very similar to what is said there. Now, we have to dig into a head taller or a head higher, depending on the English translation there. It's Gaboah, Gaboah. And this is a derivative of Gabah, Gabah, be high, exalted. That's one meaning of it. There are other derivatives, which is Gaboah, Gabah, which also means height, exaltation. It's not just denoting that it's a high place or it's exalted, which sometimes it means. Again, Hebrew words, depending on the context, can mean different things, but also means height. Now, Gaboah appears 41 times. The noun Gabah 17 times. And that's important because we're going to talk about Gabah later in this as well, because this is going to show you again how this is talking about this particular bloodline. As the root is used in its basic sense, it describes the height of persons, objects, places, and natural phenomena. The verb Gabah signifies the growing of a tree, like in Ezekiel 17:24, 31:5. The stem of a vine, which is also talked about in Ezekiel 19. The heavens in respect to the earth, that's just talked about in Psalm and Job. And then Saul being described as taller than any of his people. It also describes the high wall Manasseh built around Jerusalem in 2 Chronicles 33:14. And similarly, the adjective Gaboah describes a high mountain or high hills, high gates of Babylon, high battlements, high towers, high gallows, the horns in Daniel's vision. It's all talking about things that are physically tall, things that are extremely physically tall. So out of all these, what do you notice? Only one time is this talking about a person. All of these adjectives or nouns that Gaboah is only used when it's talking about Saul. Now, why would in all these other instances in the Hebrew, it be talking about extremely high places, extremely high trees, extremely high mountains, extremely high walls, and then all of a sudden Saul? If it's not significant for the Hebrew writer to tell you that he's that tall, then why would he use that Hebrew word? He's letting you know he's a Nephilim. He's letting you know that he represented exactly what the Israelites wanted as their king, what Yahweh didn't want to give them, what he said they didn't need. But because they pushed at him and pressed him, he said, you know what, I will give you what you want. I'm going to give you a guy who's of a Nephilim bloodline. He's in the Israelites. He's in the Israelite tribes. We're going to give you this guy and we're going to let him rule. But you're going to find out it's not what you really want because he's going to be flawed. And That's exactly what happens. But Gilboa talks about Saul being that much taller than everyone else around him. Saul was a massive man. It's said that he was so tall that he came the closest to Goliath. Now, that's a very interesting thought. I'm going to get into that in a little bit when we get to the armor of Saul. But why was Saul worried about Goliath? Why didn't he go out there on the battlefield to meet Goliath if he was in the same height range, physicality? It's even said his armor was very similar to Goliath, which it probably was. They were both Nephilim. Why was Saul so scared? Was he scared because he was of Nephilim bloodline, that he was going to meet another Nephilim on the battlefield? That was going to cause some sort of rift? Had he become so complacent and he had been on the outs with God at that point in time? He was way on the outs with God. God already told him that there was another king coming. He knew it. He didn't know who yet, but he knew there was another king coming to replace him. So he's already worried. So was that another reason he didn't want to meet Goliath on the battlefield? Because he thought that might be the catalyst that would end his life and then the new king would come in? I don't know. There's a lot of things going on there, but he was in the same range as Goliath. It's said that his body armor was comparable to the quality of Goliath's, which I've talked about in the confessionals, about Goliath's sword being a piece of technology and how his armor was also a piece of technology. And that would also lend to the fact that Saul's armor would also be a piece of technology. And we will talk about that specifically, how that works. And we know from Deuteronomy 7:1 that the Lord brought them into the land that they were to possess to drive out many nations, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, and 7 nations larger and stronger than you. These are all signifiers of Rephaim, Nephilim tribes to different degrees, right? They're not all giants, but some of them had qualities of Nephilim because they came from Nephilim bloodlines. Depending on how strong the bloodline was, some of them might not have been as tall as, 13, 14 feet tall, but they could have been in the 7-8 foot range, but they would have had abilities that would have given them advantages over normal human beings. Now, I'm going to go to a verse, Amos 2:9. Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them. Though his height was like that of the cedars, and he was as strong as the oaks, yet I destroyed his fruit above and his roots below. And whose height, this goes back to that word Goba, which we were just talking about. And Goba was the root word of Gilboa, which represented Saul earlier. Well, it's used in the same way here when it's talking about the Amorites. Height exaltation. Goba, the noun, is represented 17 times in the Bible. We just talked about Gilboa, appears 41 times. They are of the same signifier. So again, I'm just showing you that this Hebrew word, or the derivative of the same Hebrew word, was used for Saul, and then Amos 2:9 when it's talking about the Amorites, and their height was like that of the height of cedars, Goba, which is the root word of Gilboa, which was a signifier of the height of Saul. So here in Scripture, I'm showing you the two connective tissues with this Hebrew word, but it gets even deeper, especially when we start digging into the lineage of Saul. Now, you may ask, well, that's still not showing me that Saul is from a Nephilim bloodline. Not directly. You're just showing me that there's a Hebrew word that connects to another place in Scripture, in Amos, where the same Hebrew word or derivative of the Hebrew word is used to mean height or extreme height. Well, I can go even deeper to show you that the tribe that Saul came from, his lineage in the Bible will show you that he came from the Amorites, which we just talked about in Amos. So we know that the Amorites for sure are giants. This is without a shadow of a doubt. Matter of fact, they are known as wizards and alchemical geniuses on the battlefield. So their whole makeup is not only of being these ferocious giants, but also having this level of magic that they would use on the battlefields as well. So I'm going to go to 2 Samuel 21:2. At this, David summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now, the Gibeonites were not Israelites, but a remnant of the Amorites. The Israelites had taken an oath concerning them, but in his zeal for Israel and Judah, Saul had sought to kill them. So Saul was actually trying to kill these Gibeonites, and there was an oath taken before that they were supposed to be okay. It's a whole nother part of the story. But this verse is important to get us to another connective tissue to where Saul actually came from. And maybe this is why he had this feeling of anger when it came to these Gibeonites, because his bloodline was actually from these Gibeonites, who were the remnant of the Amorites, which we know from Amos, the Amorites were giants. They were tall cedars. This is blatant in Scripture. Now, side note, when I was looking through the Gibeonites and I realized that they were of the remnant of the Amorites, these remnant of the giants, these Gibeonites were of Nephilim bloodline, I happened to stumble across another David's mighty man that was a Nephilim. And I got excited because, I'm building this compelling case that there were Nephilim that were redeemed. And this was another one. So 1 Chronicles 12:4, Ishmaiah the Gibeonite, a mighty man among the 30 and leader over the 30. So Ishmaiah was a Gibeonite, a leader over the 30, and he was of Amorite bloodline. The Gibeonites were not Israelites, but a remnant of the Amorites. We know this from Scripture in 2 Samuel 21:2. 1 Chronicles 12:4, Ishmaiah the Gibeonite, a mighty man among the 30 and leader over the 30. Nephilim. I don't know how else to tell you. It's right there in Scripture. We don't have to look that hard. It's there. When we see what some of these tribes are, we see where they came from. It looks like that David's mighty men, he had quite a few Nephilim or hybrids in there. Quite a few. And it makes sense, especially when we suggest that King Saul himself was Nephilim. This wouldn't have been something that was new to David to be around. As a matter of fact, for the Israelites, when they got into the promised land, it's probably pretty commonplace to see giants, probably pretty commonplace to see hybrids. This wasn't some shocking thing. The tribes are intermingling with them. And I'm not saying that just the bloodline got all wrecked. I'm just saying there were sections of the tribes that were. And I think it's very important to note that King Saul was a Nephilim and David was of a pure bloodline. And that was very important in this struggle between King Saul and David over this kingship. It's almost an allegory in real time at that time for the struggle between Hillel and Yeshua and the coming of Yeshua. This battle between Yahweh and the evil forces that were trying to corrupt mankind, back to corrupt mankind again after the flood. You didn't stop. We're still trying to. But I love the fact that Yahweh has this grace and mercy that far surpasses what we can imagine. The fact that he is allowing people of these mixed bloodlines to find redemption, to be connected to him if they want to be. He gives Saul a chance. I mean, Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, a small clan within a small clan of the tribe of Benjamin. And I'm about to show you how he came from the Amorites, which again, according to Amos, the Amorites are as tall as the cedars. They are giants. So we're going to get to 1 Chronicles 9:35-39, and this is where we find out. Verse 35, Jeiel, the father of Gibeon, lived in Gibeon. So he's a Gibeonite. His wife's name was Maacah, Abdon was his firstborn son, then Zur, Kish, Baal, Ner, and Nadab. 37. Gedor, Ahio, Zechariah, and Milkoth. 38. Milkoth was the father of Shimeam. They two lived alongside their relatives in Jerusalem. 39. Ner was the father of Kish. Kish was the father of Saul. And Saul was the father of Jonathan, which Jonathan becomes a very close friend to David, almost a brother. And Jonathan would be of Nephilim bloodline himself, which may have been a big catalyst for why David was specifically looking for Nephilim soldiers to join his mighty men, because his best friend, Jonathan, was a Nephilim. But back to this First Chronicles 9:35-39. Jeiel was a Gibeonite. We already know from 2 Samuel 21:2. Now, the Gibeonites were not Israelites, but a remnant of the Amorites. We know from Amos, I've said this probably 4 or 5 times, that the Amorites' height was like that of cedars and were strong as the oaks. The Gibeonites were a remnant of the Amorites, and Saul came from the lineage of these Amorites. He was a Gibeonite. It trickled all the way down. It bled in from Jeiel, intermingled in to the tribe of Benjamin, and from Abdon, who was Jeel's firstborn. He had a son, Kish. Kish was the father of Saul. So we know specifically, not only does the Bible say that Saul is extremely tall. We know this from the Hebrew, but we now know from his actual lineage that he was from an Amorite lineage. And this was God's way of showing the Israelites what time it is. Think about this. God allowed Samuel to anoint Saul as king. That was never his perfect will for Israel, because it surmounted a denial as Jehovah is king over Israel, because God said earlier to Samuel, I'm the king. Why do they think they need a king? This is the Israelites getting all worked up again, as all of us do. I'm not even like pointing fingers at the Israelites, man. It's just a human trait. We want something, want it now. We want it our way. God rejected Saul from the very beginning, but he exercised humility and grace by allowing the Israelites to form their own government, like nations, knowing they would later regret it. So God took in Saul, knowing that Saul was going to reject him. I'd rather rephrase that God didn't reject Saul so much as Saul rejected God. He gave him the shot. He knew how it was going to turn out. He even warned him, I'm going to give you a Nephilim king with Nephilim DNA, what you want to see on the battlefield, what you think's going to be the correct ruler over you, that you see all these other nations do it. I'm going to show you how it's not going to work and how he is not going to do what I want him to do. Even though God changed his heart initially, he did. Saul was a prophet. So it's not like he didn't commune with God or wasn't walking with God. He just turned his back on God. And that happens with a lot of people. I know I've been there. I turned my back on God for a long time before I decided to start considering it. And then it took steps to get back to where I am now, which isn't even close in my mind. I don't think we ever get close where we think we need to get to. I just hope I'm getting to a place of even more humility and exuding more grace and mercy in my life to other people, and not judging, and trying to give an example for other people to see that, wow, if that guy and all his flaws can come back around, maybe I have a chance. And I think that, one, that's why I love talking about good Nephilim to people who think they may be of those bloodlines. Hey, you're okay. God's given you a place in his kingdom, number one. And number two, just anyone who has done the worst things ever, that you've always been given a place if you decide to come to him. And it's never going to be perfect. You're never going to be some perfect person. It's never going to be that way. But if you have the want and the desire, you will slowly get closer to him. It's just going to naturally happen if it's something that you want and you're in the word, if you're seeking after him, if you're trying to do right by the people around you. It's going to naturally happen. And it started out that way with Saul. He was doing the right thing initially. And then he slowly reverted back to his old ways, his Nephilim ways, which I think all of us could have a tendency to have Nephilim ways, even if we don't have any of that blood in us at all. Now, we'll talk about a couple of short stories of Saul just to kind of lean into this interaction with David and this armor that I think was alchemical armor, that was Nephilim armor. And we'll talk about how that is possible. And the fact that we know that King Saul now was from this Amorite bloodline, this Nephilim bloodline, that it makes it even more plausible now. I've shown you scripturally how it works. It's pretty definitive. It's not something that we have to look outside of the Bible to figure out, or, well, he took that out of context. Like, no, I just showed you the lineage that was given to us, and I showed you scripturally how it works. And the fact that this entire battle between Saul and David, which ends up happening, is significant because it shows the battle between Hillel and the coming of Yeshua. Now, the first time Saul really steps up as king in a battle format, and I've talked about this already because it's important when we were talking about the Gadites and how that Nahash, the Ammonite, came up and laid siege to Jabesh Gilead. All the men of Jabesh said to him, make a treaty with us and we will serve you. And this is that whole story I've talked about already about how Nahash said that he'll make a treaty with them, but he's going to put out their right eye. And the reason why he want to put out their right eye is because they hold their shield up over their left eye and they need to be able to see out of their right eye to be able to fight. So if he cuts out their right eye, they would have to drop their shields to fight. And at that point, they would be exposed and they would just die. So he's giving them the option, you guys want to die, or I'm just going to cut out your right eye and you guys will just be slaves to me at this point. So the elders tell him to hold off for 7 days. They want to get help. They do. They get help from Saul. This is kind of Saul's first time to step up as this Nephilim king over the Israelites. And he does. He has the Spirit of God rush through him. And again, this is when he's rolling with Yahweh. He hasn't done these major things that he does, and I'll tell you a couple of them here in a minute, where he turns his back on God. But this is when he's still rolling with God, and he's just now the king. So the Spirit of God rushes over him, and he burns with great anger. He literally takes a pair of oxen and cuts them into pieces and sends the pieces out by messengers throughout the land of Israel. And he says, this will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not march behind me and Samuel, because Samuel used to go out to battle with him, the prophet Samuel. And so the terror of the Lord falls all over the people. They come out together, and there were 300,000 Israelites and then 30,000 men of Judah. And they just roll up on Nahash and slaughter the Ammonites until the hottest part of the day. And they scattered them so much that no two of them were together. So that's how bad that they wiped them out. That's Saul, this Nephilim king who's united all the tribes of Israel, and he literally unites them by cutting up these oxen and sending out the pieces to the tribes saying, hey, I'm just going to do this to your oxen if you don't come. Now imagine you have pushed so hard to have a king, and God gives you a king, and he's a giant, and he says, well, I'm just going to do this to your oxen, maybe even to you, if you don't roll. So they unite pretty quickly. And not long after that, Samuel tells Israel that, hey, I listen to you. You got your king now. I'm old. I don't need to give you any more leadership. However, at the time, he's still going to give leadership to Saul until Saul decides to turn his back on him. And literally on the way out, Samuel meets with the top leaders in Israel and says that because they disobeyed and wanted a king, that God's going to send thunder and rain to destroy their wheat harvest that day. And he does. And so they're all in disarray and they're asking for forgiveness. And Samuel says, do not be afraid. Even though you have committed all this evil, do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. So this is just the repercussions for what you wanted. I'm just giving you a taste, but you can still trust God. Saul can still trust God. They're still given the opportunity, even though they've crossed the line. This is just the repercussions of the line that they crossed, but it's going to get worse. The Lord's already told them, this is what you wanted. This is the bed you're going to lay in it now. You asked for this Nephilim king. I gave him to you. And speaking of kingship, he reigned over Israel for 42 years. So during this period of time, he does a pretty good job of taking out a lot of these Philistines, which they had giants that rolled with them too. We clearly know from Goliath. These Philistines assembled to fight against Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops numerous as the sand on the seashore. And this is from the Bible. So they don't have all of their armies assembled. The Israelites don't. And Saul's with them. He's out there in the thick of it. Of course, that's what they wanted. They wanted a Nephilim king who's going to go to battle with them. And he is. Now, before that they can engage with these Philistines, and I just told you how many there were. There's numerous as sand on the seashore, and they're camped at Michmash, east of Bethaven. So they have to set this sacrifice, but Samuel has to be the one to do it. And they've been waiting for 7 days. But Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, where they're at in Gilgal. And so troops begin to desert Saul. Like, we don't have anything to do with this. We're leaving. So Saul decides to burn an offering and peace offerings up to the Lord. And so he's not supposed to do that. He's supposed to wait for Samuel, the prophet. After he burns the offering, of course, Samuel shows up right after. And Saul went out to greet him. Samuel knows. He probably saw the smoke because he says, what have you done? Saul replied, when I saw the troops who were deserting me, and that you did not come at the appointed time, and the Philistines were gathering at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will descend upon me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. Samuel says, you have acted foolishly. You have not kept the command that the Lord your God gave you. If you had, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler over his people, because you have not kept the command of the Lord. And he is speaking about David. He doesn't even know it's David yet, but he just knows from the Lord that there will be another king. So this is the first time that Saul does something, or his family does something that displeases the Lord. But this was the one time. This was such a egregious act that he's not going to rule for all time now. He's going to have his kingdom taken away by another who is after God's own heart. And again, this plays into this fact that he is a Nephilim. And I'm sure that weighed on him too. But the fact that God gave him plenty of chances, even being a Nephilim, he put him in that situation. He warned the Israelites. He knew how it was going to play out, but he did give him the chance. He changed his heart initially. And it's not like Saul didn't do good while he was there. He did. He did help wipe out the Philistines, or a good portion of them at the time, pushed them back. But he was supposed to be the representation of not trusting God. And what better way than to install a Nephilim into that position? And then there's another story of Saul's son, Jonathan, who I told you, who is one of David's best friends. And he and his armor bearer roll up to this Philistine outpost by themselves. And that lets you know, too, that Jonathan was a pretty big, strong man. He was of Nephilim bloodline, too. He wasn't just your typical, normal Israelite. He's from this Amorite bloodline, and he and his armor bearer roll up there and kill 20 Philistines in a field to the point that it scares all the other Philistines and they go in disarray. Now, Saul actually tells one of the priests to grab the Ark of God, or the Ark of the Covenant, which I've argued plenty of times on the show that I think it was a piece of technology that was given by Yahweh to the Israelites, but they were going to take it out to battle against these Philistines. And he sees that there's all these Philistines in disarray, and he said, well, who's not here? And they realize it's his son Jonathan. Now, he's just wiping out by himself. Now, the men of Israel were in distress that day, but Saul had placed the troops under an oath, and he said, cursed is the man who eats any food before evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies. So he is not allowing them to eat until they wipe out their enemies. But Jonathan hasn't heard this yet, and he sees all this honey in this forest. It's all over the ground. You know, the land of milk and honey. It's everywhere. He starts eating it. And again, he's not told that he couldn't do this yet. But one of the soldiers tells him that curses the man who eats food today. That is why the people are faint. And Jonathan pushes back on his dad. Typical, son, father behavior, butting of the heads. My father's brought trouble to the land. Just look at how my eyes have brightened because I tasted a little bit of honey. Much better it would have been if the troops had eaten freely today from the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been much greater? That day after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Ajalon, the people were very faint, so they rushed greedily to the plunder, taking sheep, cattle, and calves. They slaughtered them on the ground and ate meat with the blood still in it, which was sinning against the Lord, eating meat with the blood still in it. Not to mention that Saul said that they would be cursed if they did it, which is interesting too, because Saul puts a curse on them, but it wasn't necessarily with God's will, which makes me wonder, what kind of curse was this? But they did sin against the Lord by eating the meat with blood in it. And at this point, all of the Israelites come back. Jonathan's with them. And there are a pile of Philistines that they still need to take out. Now, Saul builds an altar, and he says, let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until dawn, leaving no man alive. But there's a priest with him and says, we must consult God here, but God's not talking to him. So he knows something's wrong. Something happened. Who ate when I said don't eat? And he says, even if it's my son that did it, I'll kill him. It comes out that after he and his son cast lots, after they figure out that it's not the rest of the Israelites, it's him or his son. He knows it's not his son, but he still casts lots with him anyway. And he says, well, I have to kill you because I told all these people I have to kill you. Very Nephilim behavior. Like, well, it's time to die, son, because you didn't do as I asked, and I've been challenged in front of all these people. But the people actually step in, and they say, must Jonathan die? He who accomplished such a great deliverance for Israel, never. Surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for with God's help he has accomplished this day. So the people actually rescue Jonathan from his dad. Saul was going to kill him. Again, very Nephilim behavior. I'm the one in power. I'm the one in control. Nobody else is going to have anything to do with this. Now, there's another incident where Saul really crosses the line, and this is where Samuel doesn't talk to Saul anymore, because Samuel tells Saul that the Lord sent me to anoint your king over his people in Israel. Now, therefore, listen to the words of the Lord. This is what the Lord of the host says. I witnessed with the Amalekites, who are also of Nephilim bloodline. I'm not going to get into how that works, but I'm just letting you know it does. And maybe I'll do another episode later on down the road where I talk about the Amalekites. What the Amalekites said to the Israelites when they opposed them on their way up from Egypt. Now go and attack the Amalekites and devote to destruction all that belongs to them. Do not spare them, but put to death men and women, children, infants, oxen, and sheep, camels, and donkeys. So he says, wipe them out. Wipe these Nephilim out. But instead of doing that, Saul goes down there. He spares the Amalekite king Agag, and then he takes the best of all the sheep, the cattle, the fat calves, lambs, the best of everything that they have. Saul finds this out. He gets really angry at him and says that at this point, I'm done with you. Even though Saul brings Agag out and kills him, cuts him up into pieces right in front of Samuel. And even though Samuel communes with him and they worship the Lord together, he leaves. And he says, I will not return to you, for you have rejected the word of the Lord, and he's rejected you as king over Israel. So this is like the second time Samuel's like, you're done. Yeah, we already got the new king coming on the way, but this is the last straw. I'm out now too. I'm not even going to help you anymore. So, Saul's begging for forgiveness. And it's not that he can't get forgiveness, but it's that he just repeatedly keeps doing this stuff. It's one thing if he even would have repented here. Yeah, he would have had the kingdom taken away at some point or whatever, but he would have been doing what God wanted him to do. But he repeatedly keeps going. And I could go into the jillion times he tries to kill David because he's jealous of him. That's a whole other tale. But in between this time, Samuel anoints David. He goes to David's father, Jesse, and asks him to bring all his sons. And he starts bringing all his sons before him. And, they're all big, strong. And he thinks that they're the ones. And God said, nope, 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 nope. And finally, he says, do you have any more sons? He said, yeah, I got the youngest, but he's still tending the sheep. He's like, well, we can't start with eating or anything till he gets here. When he gets there, he realizes that, he's a little skinny shepherd boy. But the Lord says that's him. So he anoints him. Now, also what's interesting is when the Spirit of the Lord departs Saul, he's given a spirit of distress. And I think that's very indicative of these demonic spirits giving him distress, and they torment him. And his servants say that this spirit of distress is tormenting you, and the best way to calm it is with somebody that can skillfully play the harp. And it just so happens that a son of Jesse of Bethlehem, David, can play the harp really well. So at that point, David starts coming and playing the harp for Saul to calm these demonic spirits so that Saul can think straight. So he actually puts David in his service. And whenever this negative spirit from God, which God allowed to torment Saul, David would pick up the harp and play, and it would give Saul temporary relief. Now, you got David, who's in the service of Saul at this point. We've got this battle with the Philistines that's been raging since Saul has taken over as king. Then comes Goliath. So 1 Samuel 17, and there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass, and he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. His staff was spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. One bearing a shield went before him. So this 6 cubits and a span comes out to be about 10 feet. And some people think maybe a little more, but roughly 10 feet, like 9'6" or something like that. He's a big dude. And if he was like 2-to-1 build, he was probably, thick boy. He was big. And if you talk about the weight of his helmet of brass, it was like 30 pounds he put on his head, which is insane. His chainmail weighed about 150 pounds, like a small man, like strapping a small man to your chest. So he's out there in front of the armies of Israel. And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel and said unto them, why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am I not a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose a man for you and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants to serve us. The Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid, which goes back to the question, what was Saul so afraid of? Now, I know Saul was probably a little older, but he's still a Nephilim. What was it that he was so afraid of that he personally didn't want to meet Goliath in battle? Was it because they were similar builds, that if he was to get beat, that would have really sunk the Israelites down? That a Nephilim took out another Nephilim? I don't know. It's a very interesting thought pattern that I hadn't thought about before with Saul of this Nephilim origin and being a man of giant stature himself. It begs the question, what was his motivation of not wanting to go out there and take him on? So, of course, David comes down, sees this going on, and he says, what shall be done to the man that killeth the Philistine and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The people answered him after this manner, saying, so shall it be done to the man that killeth them. So he would give him great riches and give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. So those were the things that were offered to him. Now, David goes to Saul. He says, I want to do it. I'm ready to do it. So I think part of the story that we forget is that David has been close to Saul this whole time. He's been playing the harp for him. He's been soothing the spirits, this tormented spirit over him. So they already got a very close rapport. Well, now David comes to Saul and says, listen, I'll go fight him. So there had to be some sort of trepidation there on Saul's part too, that I don't really want you to do this, but David's pushing. So he's okay, I'll let you do it. So verse 38, and Saul armed David with his armor, and he put a helmet of brass upon his head. Also, he armed him with a coat of mail. And in verse 39, and David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. David put them off him. So David puts the armor on. Now, a lot of people will tell you that when he put this armor on from Saul, which was Saul's armor, that it didn't fit. That David was a skinny shepherd boy, that the armor didn't fit, and that's why he took it off. But it never says the armor didn't fit. As a matter of fact, it says, I cannot go with these because I have not proved them. He is not comfortable with them. He doesn't feel that it's right. And I've always attributed this to the fact that he was told by the Lord he didn't need them. Now, let's put a couple things into context here, because I have heard the argument from some mainstream Christian theologians that David was a fully grown man. He wasn't a small shepherd boy. That's why when Saul put the armor on, that it fit him. Because again, it doesn't say that it didn't fit him. You know, those little cartoons when we were kids, we would see David with this giant armor and he was like this little kid. It didn't fit. I don't think that he was a fully grown man. I really don't, because we already know that he was small, ruddy from when he first met Samuel. Now, we could say there was a time period, a gap of some years there, and maybe he got bigger. That's possible. I'll give it a possibility. But here's where it gets interesting, is us talking about King Saul being a Nephilim. Even if David was a grown man, he would not have been able to fit the armor of a Nephilim. King Saul was a Nephilim. He was of the Amorite bloodline. He was heads above everyone else. We know this scripturally. Even if David was fully grown, he would not have been able to fit the armor. So you got to start asking, how did the armor fit? On two fronts, if he was fully grown or even if he was still a skinny shepherd boy, which I lend more to that still. I don't think he was in his fully grown era, his man era. I still don't think he was there yet. But just for argument's sake, we'll go with the mainstream Christian theologians. Fully grown man. He's not fit in a Nephilim armor, but it clearly fits him. It's just not proved, and he's not accustomed to them. You know, in the Berean Standard, which I really like, it says, I cannot walk in these. I am not accustomed to them. That's more of a better translation for proved. I haven't fought in these before. I don't know how to use these. It fits, But I want to use these. Now, armor in the Hebrew here is mada, with his armor, mada. Mada in the Hebrew stands for knowledge, thought, and science. So this armor in the Hebrew is indicative of science. So this is denoting some sort of technology. Now, with Saul being a Nephilim and coming from this Nephilim bloodline, we know that Goliath out there has some alchemical weaponry going on. And that's a whole nother story. If you want to hear me talk about the magic armor of Goliath and David and the Firestones, go listen to the episode I did with Wanayala on the confessionals. I go into deep detail about that. But this particular Hebrew word, mada, stands for knowledge, thought, or science. It would stand to reason, well, one, Saul is the king of Israel. Let's just say he's not a Nephilim. He would have access to all the greatest technology, all the greatest alchemical creations there were. But let's just say he is a Nephilim, which scripturally it looks like he is. Then he would have some sort of specialized armor, very similar to what Goliath has out there. So we're asking, well, how does it fit David? This brings us to a rabbi, Rabbi Rashi, or Shlomo Yitzhaki, and he was born in AD 1040, and he died in July 1105 AD. And he was a French rabbi who authored comprehensive commentaries on the Talmud and the Torah. He is generally considered a leading biblical exegete in the Middle Ages. Claimed for his ability to present the basic meaning of text in a concise and lucid fashion, Rashi's commentaries appeal to both learned scholars and beginning students, and his works remain a centerpiece of contemporary Torah study. So, Rabbi Rashi was in a period of time in the Middle Ages that he was revered as one of the great minds when it came to the Torah and the Talmud, and really being able to even have the average person who wouldn't really understand the text. He also has some interesting legends even built around him. And this is before I get into this idea of this alchemical armor, which he does allude to. One of the things that's talked about, his parents, Rashi's father, Yitzhak, he was a poor winemaker, was childless for many years. And his father found this precious jewel, and he was approached by these people who weren't Jewish, and they wanted to buy it to adorn their idol. So this is obviously some sort of man-made idol. Yitzhak doesn't agree to do that, but he agrees to travel with them. And en route, he casts the gem into the sea. He's like, I'm not going to let them use this to build an idol. And afterwards, it said he was visited by the voice of God, or in some stories, the prophet Elijah, and told him he would be rewarded with the birth of a noble son who would illuminate the world with his Torah knowledge. And after that, when Rashi's parents moved to Worms, Germany, again, they have a hard time having a child. His mother was pregnant. She's walking down one of the narrow streets, and she was imperiled by two oncoming carriages. She turned and pressed herself against a wall, which opened to receive her. This miraculous niche is still visible in the wall of the Worms synagogue. This wall opened up to protect her from these two carriages. So just the idea of Rashi coming to this world, it seems like he was protected by God, at least by the legends and the stories. Now, another interesting connection with Rashi to this story of Saul and David, it said that he was a descendant of King David. So that would make him highly motivated to really study the text when it comes to the deeper meanings of them. And part of this deeper meaning when it comes to this armor being an alchemical piece of technology was what Rashi talks about. So part of this midrashic interpretation by Rabbi Rashi, he says that when David attempted to wear King Saul's armor in the Bible, which I think that King Saul gave him the armor to show David that he didn't need to go out into battle. I'm going to put this Nephilim armor on you, and it's not going to fit you, even though it's this great piece of technology. It's not going to fit you. It's not going to work. You're not going out to battle. One, I don't think he wanted him to go out into battle because he was his heart player, and he helped quiet the spirits when they were attacking him. But Rashi says that the armor miraculously adjusted to fit David's smaller frame, signifying divine intervention in David's special status as God's chosen one. Also, when David was clothed with the garb, he was small and short. Saul was head and shoulders tall. He's a Nephilim. But his garb fit David perfectly, and this was proof that David, of blessed memory, was fit to be king. When he saw that his garb fit David perfectly, he looked upon him with an evil eye. This is when the jealousy comes in. Again, I think this was a Nephilim alchemical piece of technology that probably had all kind of different traits. But according to Rabbi Rashi, and this is something that I've dug deeper into, it was the Lord that caused this alchemical piece of armor to fit David perfectly. This would have driven Saul mad because he already knows there's someone coming to take his spot. He doesn't know who it is. He's been hanging out with David this whole time. Why would he be worried about this little shepherd boy? He's a Nephilim giant. He's expecting probably somebody to come along that's similar to him to take his spot. At least that's how he's feeling that the information is coming from the prophet Samuel. Now he sees this armor, this magical piece of armor fit David. It drove him mad. And then David tells Saul, I can't go with this. I haven't proved this. I'm not accustomed to this. I'm going to go fight Goliath with no armor. He goes out there with the sling and stones. That would have driven Saul mad. And not only that, it was the catalyst which took David into the kingship, which took the kingship away from Saul and gave it to David. And this started this huge series of events where Saul tries to kill David numerous times. David starts building an army to take the kingship. He's on the run from Saul for a long time. There's some very interesting stories there. A ton of quote unquote magical stories that go on there, especially when it comes to the Witch of Endor, the giant's alchemical sword that's involved a couple times throughout the story. A lot of interesting stuff that we won't talk about today. But I wanted to really break this down for you guys and show you how that King Saul was specifically put into power by God as a Nephilim, because this is what the Israelites wanted. He wanted to show them that what you want doesn't work. He gave them all a chance. He even gave Saul a chance. Like I said earlier, he changed his heart in the beginning. But Saul, because of his hubris, and he gets really jealous when David starts getting all the recognition. You know, the Israelites start saying that Saul's killed his thousands, but David's killed his 10,000s. And he starts upping the ante with David consistently, basically trying to get him killed by the Philistines, but he keeps passing the barometer. As a matter of fact, when he goes to give him Michal, his daughter, he tells David that he has to go out as part of a dowry and bring 100 Philistine foreskins. Foreskins. And bring them back to Saul as part of a dowry to be able to marry Michal, his daughter. Which, by the way, it's very interesting that Saul's daughter was one of David's wives he didn't have any children with. So this also denotes this idea that the messianic line was kept free from Nephilim DNA. Although it lived throughout the other tribes in different formats, it didn't thrive with David. And this is a perfect example of that. Saul's daughter and David had no children. And it's just another signifier that Saul's bloodline was of a Nephilim bloodline that, again, God used. But to the point that God can redeem anyone, he gave Saul a chance. He gave him an opportunity, and he didn't do what God asked him to do. And it caused a series of events where it ends up that Saul kills himself and David eventually takes over and becomes the king of Israel. And there are tons of great stories with David and giants and mighty men and all that good stuff that I love talking about. But I really thought it would be very interesting to talk about King Saul, the Nephilim today, because I don't hear that talked about very much in this space. And I know there will probably be a lot of people push back on me with this, but I've given you the scripture and I've given you the lineage. I've given you all the information that you need to make a well-informed decision for yourself. And I love going deep as I can in the Bible and looking at all the interesting, weird stuff because, man, it's just exciting. And for people that don't think the Bible's that exciting, I'm telling you it is. It's a lot of fun. But before I get out of here, guys, I'm going to read a few reviews. I always do this at the end. You guys have been lighting them up. Continue to light them up. It's really helping the algorithm. It's helping the show grow. You guys have been awesome with sharing the show. Share the show. That's one of the best ways that you can get this show out there into other people's eyes and ears, depending on whether you're watching on YouTube or Rumble or listening to it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any other place that you listen to podcasts. We're going to start with Apple Podcasts. Start with Vicky's amazing show. Love the show. Heard about you from the confessionals, and this show passed any expectations I had. The Crowley episode was my favorite. I'd love to hear your take on Adolf. Keep up the great work. Appreciate that, Vicky's. We've got Schlutopia, a welcome reprieve from conspiracies. Rabbits is the wellness spa rehab we need after we've woken up and realized the world's not what we thought it was. But it'll be okay because now we're going inward and focusing on our spiritual connections. We've done all the pills, red pills at the after party that turned into black pills at the after party. Now it's time to go outside and listen to this awesome podcast while we touch all the grass. I love hearing Joel's take on things because it's the reminder I need that the world is only as crazy as I allow my brain to think it is, and I can change my mind anytime I want. Do yourself a solid and listen to this podcast. Your brain will thank you. Appreciate that, Schlutopia. All right, we've got one more from Apple Podcast. That odd. Joel's back at it with his latest podcast, Free the Rabbits, and we couldn't be squeezing our cheeks any tighter. By combining his love for the truth, hidden knowledge, and humanity, we see his attitude towards conspiracies, the Bible, and paranormal experiences take on a new and refreshing voice of its own. Thank you for all your hard work. 5 stars. Appreciate that. That odd. All right, we've got Spotify. This episode was super fascinating. I knew nothing about trolls, yet a few months ago I had a dream where I was in Scotland, lulled into some caves underground, and came in. And I would love for you to listen to episodes out there by Vicky Joy Anderson, because maybe you weren't in a dream. Maybe you were in an astral realm, and maybe you were seeing some trolls. Just throwing that out there. It's possible. We've got Bobby Joe Medina. Great show. Have y'all heard of or visited Mount Orab, Wisconsin? The entire town celebrates troll lore and heritage. They have trolls all over town. I believe I did talk to Justin about that. He told me about Mount Orab, Wisconsin, and he said it's pretty fascinating over there. All right, we've got Ingrid Dawn. Hey, Joel, great episode. I actually heard on Isaac Weishaupt pod that Miley Cyrus actually did stab Donald Marshall. There's a real photo of him on a Megadeth album cover. Bing it and check out the album cover. Very creepy. I have actually seen that. It kind of looks like him, even though they say it's not him, obviously, but I can see some comparisons there. Maybe. I am a lot more on board with the Donald Marshall stuff than I used to be. And maybe I'll have an opportunity of having him on the show. I think that would be kind of cool. I'd love to hear his story from him. I think that would be really interesting. All right, we're going to go to YouTube. We've got Sean Povaleka 9321. Oh man, I live in Dayton. I didn't know about those statues. Can't wait to go see them now. So cool. Yeah, the statues are pretty awesome in Dayton, Ohio. We've got Fins Up 13. My favorite topic, most interesting to me, is trolls and fey elves. Great episode. We want more on this, please. And we will definitely dig into some fey stuff down the road. I can promise you that. 88 Earth Star. Oh, I love this one so much. Cryptids of the Corn with Joel. Super fun collab. Love, love, love. Now let's all hug some rocks and hope we can make a friend with a troll. I'm sure there are some people that would say that, no, they're Nephilim. Don't do that. I'm not in the camp of thinking that every troll's evil. I don't think that's a great way to look at things. I think we have to be more open-minded and understand that there's so many different layers and nuances that happen in the supernatural world and in our real world that there's no way we got it all figured out. And the idea of, I don't understand it, so it bad, okay, it bad, is just played out. And I think that we got to have more knowledge about these things before we can make assumptions that something's evil. I think there's definitely evil all around us, but I don't think that we have to be constantly saying everything's evil. And I do appreciate the majority of the people listening to the show that also think that way. But anyway, guys, thanks for joining me for another great episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And we will play a different song here on the way out. We're going to play Shut Up and Drive. You know what it is, guys. Go outside, touch grass, and get your tail out the hole.
Away from enemies, from revenge be near. To avenge my peers, I confess my sins right here. When a pelican swim and the great whites fly, aboard Noah's Ark and enjoy thy ride. But the matrix don't care, we enjoy cloud 9. 6'3" Nicola, no order particular. DeLorean dreams of the crack cell, but we know the crack gon' sell. So if it's a variable, don't work well. I wasn't here when Reagan was a cartel. Push a bar, do I rap, do I sing, do I preach, I don't know. Do I lack anything via love? No, I don't. But we gotta be a warrior too, cause that's just what warriors do. Baby, you cannot fool me with the eye. You get them every single time. I tell them shut up and drive. Baby, you cannot fool me with the eye. You get them every single time. I tell them shut up and drive. Staring up at Olympus, tight spear back of pretentiousness. Decades is vintage, new Babylon built on contentiousness. Clash on the road to Rome, we're gladiators who broken, but ain't no breaking us all. Yeah, they just wanna take the air, code download the airs. Teleport the chopper, I'm a rebel like here. Double helix intervenix with Jesus, I'm a chimera. Looking at these golden years flying by fair force. They cutting it off for the food too. Analytics they used to recruit you. War's opinion that sets on your Sun Tzu. They don't want the individual, just a carbon copy. True spitting that manicotti, yeah, I'm talking saucy. All they wanna build is a prison world full of pet Tamagotchis. Living kamikaze, got me out of body like I'm Goku SS3. They wanna push me to the center like a cell, they wanna spin up at the center of the nexus, me.